So it's a great pleasure to welcome today's speaker, Dr. Heather Leslie. Heather is the director of the Darling Marine Center in Walpole and a professor in the School of Marine Science. As you'll see, she has a deep commitment to strengthening connections between science, policy, and management. She's plays, I guess, many leadership roles in Maine and beyond. She's briefed local, state, and federal decision makers about a wide range of sustainability issues. Co-lead on the Maine Climate Council's Coastal and Marine Working Group. She's on the board of trustees of the Nature Conservancy in Maine. She's contributed to statewide economic and workforce development as the co-founder of the Alliance for Maine's Marine Economy. And like a lot of wonderful faculty who are connected with the Mitchell Center here, she's come to believe that community university partnerships are a key to making progress in addressing complex sustainability challenges. And so I'm going to hand it over to her. The title of her talk today is How Can Researchers Contribute to Coastal Community Resilience? Please join me in welcoming Heather.
So please do contact me. That's why my name was up there at the end and now at the beginning too. I'm really excited to have the chance to talk with you in real time this next hour and via Zoom, but also I'm eager to make connections through this session after the talk. So note I can be reached on email and also through the university phone. And we had a bit of a collaboration, I think, on the title of this talk. And I'm excited that it's framed as a question, as I think David just said. None of us have the whole answer to this and related questions, but that's one of the wonderful things about the Mitchell Center is to come together to try to figure out what answers we've come up with and what better ones we can create together. Is the sound okay? Is it working all right? All right, great, thank you. So as David said, my name is Heather Leslie, and I'm director of the Darling Marine Center in Walpole. And I have the privilege to work with a number of students and faculty and community partners and other folks on community engaged research from Walpole. And I just want to start with a couple of definitions in answering this question, because we all have different understandings of these important terms, and there's also a lot of overlapping terms that relate. And that's one of the things I'd love to talk about toward the end. By community engaged research, I'm referring to a process where research is conducted with community members to ensure mutually beneficial outcomes. So that's a really big and broad definition. It relates to definitions of participatory action research, of engaged research, of community-based research, of translational research. There's probably about 18 different terms that mean something somewhat like this. And I chose this definition because it is broad and because it's focused on outcomes and because it talks about reciprocity and mutual benefit among people with different interests and lived experiences. And we'll talk a bit more about why that matters in the cases I want to share with you today in a moment. By resilience, I'm talking about the ability of an individual or system to maintain functioning in the face of substantial environmental or economic change. And we're seeing, as we have for millennia in Maine, examples of resilience on our coast. There's a lot of challenges right now facing our fisheries, particularly our lobster fishery. And fisheries, not only in Maine, but around the world, have demonstrated their ability as individual fishers, but also as communities of fishers to be resilient to change. And that's been a big focus of the work that I've done in the last 20 years here in Maine and also on the coast of Mexico. And I'm looking forward to sharing with you today. A fundamental thesis or assumption of my work is that resilient coastal communities of people, depend on the resilient ecosystems that they're part of. And we could spend a whole hour talking about examples and exceptions to this thesis, but I just want to make it clear that this is the perspective that I'm operating from, based on empirical research and theory that comes from a wide variety of fields, both in the biophysical and the social sciences. And part of the reason it's so important that we think about this connection between resilient ecosystems and the people and the communities that are part of them is because we value and benefit from marine and coastal systems in so many ways. And there's just a few images here to illustrate that. There's the benefits of food and research and recreation and education and employment, all of which come from our oceans, which make up more than 70% of planet Earth. So figuring out ways to sustain resilient human communities and the ecosystems they're a part of is really critical in order to sustain these ecosystem services. And now, more than a couple decades ago, Gretchen Daly and colleagues published a book that I encourage you all to go get from the library if you don't have it on your bookshelf. And it's a book that lays out some of the original thinking, some of the initial thinking on the importance of ecosystem services as a concept. Now in 2022, decades later, the federal government is using this concept of ecosystem services to set up what are called natural capital accounts to keep track of our assets on the national level using a framework not unlike this one here on the slide. And just to explain what you see in all these little bubbles, we'll have a few diagrams like this in the next hour. I've just made the assertion, backed up by Daly and others, that services or the benefits that ecosystems provide is a really important connector point between the health and the functioning of ecosystems at different scales, and also people and the institutions and the cultures that they're part of. And that's not to say that there aren't many important critiques of focusing on ecosystem services or these benefits, and particularly how they've been monetized or attempted to be monetized through time. But there are actually a lot of non-monetary ways to think about these services like fisheries and food. And this is an important element of the work I'll be talking about today. So to think a little bit more broadly about the role of services and how they serve as this connection point between people and nature, I'd go even further and say that while it may not be within the purview of an individual investigator or working practitioner, in order to truly understand how to sustain these services and the benefits that they provide to people, you really got to look at the biggest blob on the screen, the social ecological system. And often working in a team science manner, you want folks that are paying attention to the details of the social domain and others that are thinking about the ecological domain. And the work that I want to spotlight for you today, work that's been supported and catalyzed by the Mitchell Center, among others, really emphasizes this interchange between the social and the ecological, and paying attention not only to all the pieces, but to the emergent properties that come from understanding these interactions. So today I'll talk a bit more about a more defined version of that social ecological systems framework that I just shared, one developed by Eleanor Ostrom that people all over the world rely on to guide their investigations. And then I'll give an example, just one. It was hard to pick just one, but one example of the social ecological system science that we're doing from Walpole at the Darling Marine Center. And then I'll preview a couple of ongoing projects that use this same framework, but in pretty different ways that members of my research group are leading. And before we go any further, I just want to acknowledge that there's at least three people in the room who are actively using this framework. So I'm one of many people who can speak to its application. And I hope that part of our discussion coming up will be some interchange on what people find useful and not so useful about it. So as I mentioned, Eleanor Ostrom is the person who identified and described the social-ecological systems framework. In fact, she was awarded the Nobel Prize in Economics in 2009, specifically for her publication in Science that's noted here. It's also really important to realize that Lynn's work was drawing upon the collective effort of hundreds of people worldwide working on collective action, natural resource challenges in fisheries and freshwater and forests and other ecosystems around the world. And so not only was she an amazing empiricist, helping many people bring together the knowledge from these different systems, she was also a really careful thinker and theorist. And that led to this paper that many of us draw on in our work. This is an adaptation of that framework from 2009 that's been tailored to coastal fisheries. And I just want to call your attention to the 4 colored blocks because those are most relevant to the talk today. This is like that bubble diagram I showed you before, but with a slightly different emphasis. I would argue more of a human behavior emphasis, but that's something we could debate later. So on the left-hand side are the environmental components of the social ecological system, according to Ostrom's framework. In the blue is the coastal marine ecosystem, within which fisheries species in the green on the bottom left are living. So these target fisheries species, typically in the Ostrom framework, are considered one at a time as the target resource, and they are of great interest to fishers and other key actors who are involved in the management or engaged in receiving benefits from these target species and the ecosystem that they're part of. The people in yellow, the actors in yellow, usually they're people, they are connected to one another and to other groups of people through local and higher level institutions, some of them specific to their sector, fisheries, others more general. And so as an ecologist, I think of these 4 boxes as essentially the structure of the social ecological system. And as someone who was trained as a community ecologist, it's really hard for me to imagine thinking about the dynamics of a system like this until I have a reasonable handle on the structure. So a lot of the work I've done over the last 15 years in Maine and in Mexico has focused on identifying and articulating structure of social ecological systems. And it's taken a lot of time and a lot of people's effort. When I was last here in 2015 talking, I spoke about the Mexico work, and I'd love to come back and give an update on that sometime in the future because it continues. But I would say that we shouldn't forget about what's at the center of this framework, which is looking at the dynamics and how individual people intersect and interact with one another, and also with the other components of this social ecological system. So in some ways, this is the juiciest bit here in the middle. But after working on it for 15 years, I'll say we've barely scratched the surface of the middle. We're still very much defining and identifying the structure. And that's because that's not a simple task in and of itself. Here are variables that Ostrom offers as ways to specifically operationalize or make sense of those 4 boxes in the previous slide. And I don't expect you're able to read through each of these boxes. What I just want to illustrate through this slide, and you can see it in the 2009 paper if you look it up, is that there's more than one way to describe an ecosystem or a fishery or the institution that the fishers are part of. And in fact, one thing that we've come to realize in using this framework over the last decade is that we don't necessarily need to be entirely bound by this list, that it was intended and has been written about since 2009 quite a bit, that there are different ways to use this list of variables. And it's quite important to think about how to use them productively depending on the research questions and context within which you are operating. As I mentioned, much of my work on this topic has been in the coastal marine fisheries of Baja California Sur and the Gulf of California region. And it's through that work with many collaborators and community member partnerships and conversations that I've come to realize that coupled system science is really worth calling out and distinguishing from the larger umbrella of sustainability science to which it contributes. And there's three reasons why I'd make that assertion. The first is that coupled system science embraces the reciprocal links among people and nature. Secondly, it harnesses knowledge from both the natural sciences and the social sciences. And finally, it contributes to solutions, and solutions in a way that perhaps we haven't had the opportunity to seek before. Much of the coupled system science that I do these days is focused on supporting ecosystem-based approaches to marine management. And so just to define that a little bit, it recognizes the connections we've been talking about. It's also importantly place-based. You can't do ecosystem-based management in the ether. You need to ground it on a map somewhere. It also encompasses the many different goals, whether they be different ecosystem services or value sets that people have for ocean ecosystems. And finally, it attends to changing conditions, including changing climatic conditions, so we can manage for both resilient ecosystems and resilient human communities. More recently, many of the projects, including the one I'll introduce today, have been focused on social ecological resilience in the context of climate impacts and climate change and adaptation. And if you're not familiar with the work of the Maine Climate Council, I encourage you to check out what that group has been doing. The next meeting, I believe, is happening in early December. The Climate Council meets quarterly, and they have really exciting updates on climate action implementation here in Maine. So for the bulk of my talk, again, I want to give an example of how to make these bubble diagrams real and hopefully incite some discussion on other ways we might make these frameworks real. And to do that, I want to draw on the Maine Coastal Community Resilience Project, which was initiated in 2017. Feels like it's been that long. In 2017, thanks to funding from the Saltonstall-Kennedy program through the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration. And the goals of this project are threefold. First, to identify features that contribute to resilience to change, both in the social and environmental domains. Secondly, to synthesize and to map that information so people can more easily access and use it to make decisions. And third, to create what NOAA called community bridge plans and other products or boundary objects that can help communities plan for the future and adapt to change. So, in late 2016, we wrote this proposal, we being a very large group of people led by Joshua Stoll of Marine Sciences and myself. And we convened this group and asked them to help us figure out what those words on the last slides mean for coastal Maine and how to involve students in as much of this work as we possibly could. And so the faces you see on this slide represent people with many different professional backgrounds, from state government to local nonprofit environments, students at the beginning of their careers, others sort of in the middle, people who were with us for just a summer, others who still haven't left, which is wonderful. So a really big team effort. And one of the neatest things about this team effort is that it wasn't entirely programmed from the beginning. And I give NOAA and Saltonstall-Kennedy a lot of credit for this, how they award their proposals and their interest in this grant call seem quite distinct from many other federal agencies. And they have an openness and an interest in community-oriented outcomes and engagement that I think is really notable and something that we were great beneficiaries and I hope took full advantage to deliver back to them and our partners in a meaningful way. So I did mention that this project started in 2017, but for me, it actually did begin about 24 years before that. when in the late 90s, I had the opportunity to visit Stonington, Maine, and the island of Isle Ho, just off the coast in down East Maine, as a guest of the Wilson family. And I was in Stonington between ending my time in Maine, where I had probably 5 different jobs in 1997 and 1998, including as a temp at the Darling Marine Center and an AmeriCorps volunteer. I was just about to go start graduate school at Oregon State in marine ecology. And Carl Wilson, one of the collaborators on this project, and his family welcomed us out to the island for 4th of July before we drove west for the beginning of a 20-year-long journey, because that's how long it took to get back to Maine in 2015. And so while I had the opportunity to be out on Isle Ho with the Wilson family, I met the former commissioner of the Department of Marine Resources, Robin Alden, who was in the thick of enabling and catalyzing transformation of Maine fishery management with many, many other folks involved by creating a series of zones for lobster fishing. And creating probably isn't quite the right word, because what those zones are is representation, formal representation of informal arrangements and rules that lobstermen themselves have established for a long time and are continually negotiating, from what I understand, from Jim Wilson's work and Jim Atchison's work and talking with fishermen themselves. So the reason I tell you this long ago beginning is to illustrate what is perhaps the most important conclusion I have to share with you today, which is that important things take a long time. And you may not know they're important when you start doing them. And I would assert that engaged scholarship is no different than any other important thing, that it takes a long time and that you have to have faith that some of the time you spend will teach you new things, if nothing else, patience, which is something I'm always learning. And that a project funded in 2017 might not have happened if it wasn't for a visit to an island I didn't know I'd ever have the opportunity to visit again nearly 20 years before. One thing that really stuck with me when I returned to Maine in 2015, when the right-hand side of this figure comes from, was how much Maine's ocean waters had changed in the last couple decades. And this is something that's really shaped how our team, the Coastal Community Resilience team, has thought about where to focus our work. I'm showing you data here that come from the Maine Department of Marine Resources and were collated by Heather Deese, an alum of the University of Maine, in a 2017 publication called Waypoints. And you can see all you need to understand from this figure from the size and the color of these pie charts. If you look on the left, you can see that the smaller pie has more colors. There's a wider variety of species that were caught by Maine fishermen in 1995 than were caught by Maine fishermen in 2015, when the larger pie, more money, more lobster, there's a larger pie of lobster here, but you can see that the other colors, the other species, are much diminished in terms of their proportional contribution to the overall catch. So this is a situation that has been analyzed in many different ways and that many people are managing day to day in their livelihood and trying to plan for on much shorter time scales than what's listed here. And if you're interested in this, I encourage you to read Bob Stenick and others' paper on the gilded trap, because if you know anything about Maine's coast, you know lobster is a very lucrative and important business in terms of shaping our coastal communities, but it's also a very scary large portion of the economic engine of many of our coastal communities. These data are a little bit different now, 7 years later, but the overall lack of diversity is still pretty striking. So to summarize the overall outcomes of this project, before I dive in deep on some work that we've done at the local level, just want to share the bigger picture. The first was a series of statewide analyses that was guided by that social ecological systems framework that I introduced above. And we had big plans of identifying tens of data sets that would help us to empirically characterize what places along the coast are more resilient than others to change. We're still working on that project, and I think it's a valuable project. However, what we realized when we started to do this work at the statewide level and then also zoom into some local collaborations in Georgetown and Damascotta and Newcastle, as I'll talk about in a moment, we realized that the framework I showed you, all the bubble diagrams, it wasn't very interesting to talk about at selectmen meetings or shellfish committee meetings, or even in the grocery store. I don't know about you, but I've had a really hard time figuring out a way to explain the SES framework in the grocery store. And I spend a lot of time talking about science in the grocery store. What we realized instead, and I think this was really an insight that Josh and maybe Melissa Britch came to first, was that we might be better served, or the folks we were trying to share back information with might be better served if we pulled apart the social ecological systems framework and instead ensured that there were ways to give back or bring back good data, particularly related to fisheries landings, that could be used for local level decision making. And so a quick example of that, I don't have a slide for this, but it comes from work that dual degree student Marina Kakuza led in the community of Georgetown on the Mid-Coast, where she served as a staff member for the Comprehensive Planning Committee, developing a revision of their plan for that community. And year after year, people in Georgetown had appropriately filed their landings report and sent data to the DMR. But it was actually a little bit complicated, not impossible, but a little bit complicated for them to get those data back as a community in a way that they could then use to inform the narrative of this report that Marina was helping them to write. And so through the course of her sitting in on these meetings, I don't think she talked about the SES framework, but we'd have to ask her. And going back to Carl Wilson and colleagues at the Department of Marine Resources and talking with Josh and me as she started to outline the chapters for her dual degree thesis, we realized, this is a real need. The communities need to be able to access these data in an easier way. And I think we can only take this much credit for it. But what happened within 3 years was the department decided to serve all these data in an accessible format. And now if you Google Maine Department of Marine Resources, look for lobster landings first, it'll pop up most easily. You can see lobster landings by community statewide. And from what I understand, you couldn't do that 10 years ago. It's not that the department wasn't happy to share it. It was just that the process by which they got it back out the door was much more complicated. So our conversations, it didn't lead to this amazing portal that you can hopefully Google now. But it was a small piece in the thinking and the great work that DMR does to try to be as responsive and as equitable as possible in that responsiveness to communities along our coast. So Marina's work with Georgetown helped to catalyze that. We did some other place-based work in Damascotta and Newcastle, and I'll talk about that more in a moment. And the outcome that I'm most proud of is the list of folks who contributed to this work over the last 5 years. And this is still a developing project, thanks to work with the Mitchell Center and others. So we've had 8 graduate students involved in this project. Some they're all in, it's their whole thesis. Others who are in a thin slice or are huge helpers out in the field on cold November days. All those people have been integral to getting the work done. We've had 4 postdocs. Again, most of those folks have other projects that are primary for them, but they've served as mentors and reflectors and disseminators of the work that this project is doing, all the way from California to Stockholm, which has been really neat. And we've had a number of undergraduate students doing capstone projects and summer internships and semester-long projects. And thanks to the work that Sarah's led that I'll talk about next, we've had more than 50 high school students over the last 5 years involved in the project. And as of Friday, that includes my 16-year-old son, something I never thought I'd see. Sarah said he did okay. So there is Isaac and Sarah on Friday. Our latest field work was to wrap up the 2022 field season related to the Shellfish Community Science Project. This is a community-based collaboration that certainly was catalyzed by this larger SK grant that I spoke about before from NOAA, but it wouldn't have happened if it wasn't for the leadership of Sarah Risley and her fellow graduate student, Melissa Britch, and also thanks to the support, both financial and otherwise, from the Mitchell Center. So I want to spend most of my remaining time, I think it's about 3:35 now, if I'm correct. Is that right? Okay. Don't have my glasses on. I want to just share with you some of what Sarah's been doing, and I'm counting on her correcting and expanding on anything I don't get quite right, because it is a complicated project. So as I mentioned, there are a number of core partners in this community project, and this was something that we designed into the larger NOAA project from the beginning, but we had no idea how it would actually work out. And that's another precept, I would say, of community engaged research, that there's only so much planning you can do. That planning's important, but listening and responding to what you hear is even more important. So the core partners in this program include Lincoln Academy, the local high school, the Darling Marine Center, the University of Maine's Marine Laboratory in Walpole, the towns of Newcastle and Damascotta there, and the bubbles up to the right, and then also the town of Bremen. So we work not only in Damascotta and Newcastle, but also in the neighboring estuary of the Madomic in the town of Bremen. And as I said, there's a number of folks who supported and enabled this work, and certainly funding is really critical to appropriately compensate graduate students and undergraduate interns, but there's also a lot of moral support and expertise that comes along with this. And that's why I want to be sure to acknowledge not just the funders, but also scientists at UMaine and the Down East Institute and Manomet, who contributed a lot of knowledge that enabled us to pull this off. This project too started a little bit before it actually started. So in 2019, nearly graduated graduate student Cara Pello, just because she didn't have enough to do, that's not the only reason, decided to be the lead scientist on a town-led effort to study local shellfish resources. And Cara's interest and creation of space for this endeavor is something that I think we're all really grateful for. And again, maybe not something that she could have predicted would be so powerful or long-lasting when she signed up for it. Here she is with Ryan Fraser, who's the chair of our Shellfish Committee. And this picture is particularly meaningful because the reason why Cara took this on was because she heard that the Shellfish Committee was interested in applying for a grant, but they needed a science consultant essentially to lead that part of the work. And it also created an opportunity for Cara, who hadn't done a lot of grant writing, to try her hand at that and to do it in a really engaged fashion really quickly. So this led to a project that was funded by the Broadreach Fund in early 2019 with the town as the lead, the town of Damascotta, and Cara as the lead scientist, and a number of us supported her in the field and in other ways. And 3 years later, it's become a project that Sarah Risley leads and formed the basis of her dual degrees in marine policy and marine biology, which she defended successfully earlier this year. And so this is sort of the built out version of what Cara helped initiate early on. And you can see that there's three big components working together here. There's local knowledge from the shellfish harvesters who know the resources on the clam flats. and have an important interest in ensuring that those resources are sustained through time. There's the opportunity for community science, where university and high school students can contribute to doing ecological surveys like the picture you just saw, as well as helping to document and collate local knowledge of harvesters and others. And together with existing social and ecological data, this can help inform ecosystem-based management, which is happening at many different scales. I'm an appointed member of the Shellfish Committee, along with Ryan Fraser and 4 other representatives from the towns of Damariscotta and Newcastle. And so together, we engaged in ecosystem-based management through that committee. Our responsibility is to set the number of licenses that are sold to people inside and outside the town to harvest shellfish every year. And we also make other decisions about place-based management in the areas that Damariscotta and Newcastle are responsible for under the statewide statute that supports shellfish management in the state of Maine. It's a co-management system, so a lot of the responsibility falls on municipalities, on volunteer committees like ours, provided that the towns are willing to take that responsibility on. So we make these decisions. We're mandated by our local ordinance and by state statute to make these decisions about how many licenses and where people can harvest. Until recently, to my knowledge, folks on this committee didn't have data from the flats themselves upon which to base these decisions. And so the work that Sarah and Kara and others have done these last few years, thanks to Mitchell Center support and many others, has enabled us to really make informed decisions, begin to make more informed decisions about the ecosystem of the Damariscotta River estuary. And of course, we make those decisions. Sometimes they're right, sometimes they're not. We only know if we go back and continue to monitor and to listen in the ecological system, but also in the social system. And so that's the process we're still engaged in further understanding and generating and collating that local knowledge. And we're specifically interested in how we might use local knowledge appropriately to help inform future scientific studies, so that those future scientific studies, again, contribute to this virtuous circle of community science and ecosystem-based management. So is it all done or all right? We don't know yet, because it's an ongoing project, but I can tell you that it's been really exciting, and we've learned a lot that we wouldn't have otherwise if we hadn't started with the listening part at those Shellfish Committee meetings. A really critical element of the research agenda of the last several years was one that Sarah and Melissa Britch led, and that's focused on collating local knowledge. And they did that through what is referred to as a participatory mapping study. And this occurred during COVID, so it was largely a study that was enabled by snail mail and also phone conversations. And essentially what they did was develop an atlas for each of the 2 estuaries of interest, the Damariscotta shown here, and then the Madomic, which is just to the east. And the idea was that a person, a harvester or a shellfish farmer, or someone else with local expertise would know a lot about one of these blocks, and that then they would be asked to explain what they know about that smaller part of the estuary using this series of beautiful stickers that a group of folks came up with through this project over the last several years. So they would populate this gazetteer page essentially with these stickers and annotate it where appropriate to indicate areas of high abundance of shellfish, for instance. And then through a series of follow-up interviews that Sarah and Melissa conducted with each of the respondents on this mapping study, we ended up with maps like this. This map on the right shows you, based on local knowledge by at least 3 individuals within each square, the average abundance of soft-shell clam, particularly in the upper estuary. And I know it's perhaps a little bit hard to see, but there's areas, quadrats, that have very deep blue representing high clam abundance, and then areas of very low abundance, which is the lighter blue. And so what we found through this mapping study is that the upper Damariscotta River estuary has areas of high clam abundance and also hosts oysters and quahogs and razor clams in some spots. This area is home to a variety of human activities, including shell fishing, harvest for recreation and for commercial reasons, as well as sea farming, kayaking, and sailing. And not surprisingly, if you stop to think about it, all those oyster farms have contributed to wild populations of oysters, and those are pretty important for the wild shellfish harvesters at this point. And one of the interesting things that came out of this mapping study is that we learned about species and activities that haven't received as much attention as, say, aquaculture or softshell clam, and that included the local menhaden harvest. This figure is another way of looking at some of the data that were collected through this mapping study, and it shows, based on local knowledge, changes in the Damariscotta River estuary through time. And there was a survey instrument that the researchers used in order to systematically quantify people's understanding of change through time. And so you can see that many people noted that there was quite a large change in aquaculture activity in the Damariscotta River estuary over the period of time that they had been making observations. In contrast, down here you see that there's been a much smaller change, a decrease in activity related to lobstering and other commercial fishing. So this gives us a sense of what's on people's minds and also the types of activities that they have the most observations to share about. One of the things that was highlighted a little bit in that last slide was how wild shellfish harvesters in the Damariscotta have now characterized this estuary as an oyster river. And specifically in the last 30 years, oysters and oyster farming have taken off. It's nothing but oyster farming on the river right now. It's solid full of natural oysters because of the overflow from the farms. They obviously spit out seed. So it's become an oyster river, much more so than clamming. That's really quite a unique situation compared to other estuaries in Maine. And it's something that's really caught our attention, both because it's become an important economic driver for some of the harvesters harvesting wild shellfish, but also because it's highlighted different people's different understandings about the ecological connections between wild oyster populations, farmed oyster populations, and the populations of other wild shellfish, including softshell clams. And the drivers of change, I'm not going to go through here in the interest of time, but I will just say that this is going to form sort of the foundation of Sarah's PhD work now. This knowledge that shellfish harvesters shared with us in the Damariscotta and also in the Madomic is really shaping our thinking about how to study ecologically the connections among these populations. Sarah and fellow students also led a series of ecological surveys, and we oriented these ecological surveys specifically to enable undergraduate and high school student researchers to participate. And so while the data that they've generated about the shellfish resource are important, in some ways it's what's just as important as that kids are out on the flats and learning about the resource and also learning what science is about. And I've talked around all this without showing you the actual species, but these species are the ones that we're focused upon given their commercial significance. So just to wrap up and segue to my last couple slides here, I hope that I've illustrated that engaged research isn't always something that you can map out to the minute, that it requires a willingness to listen and to respond to what people's interests and concerns are. And we've been fortunate that we've been able to do that through a combination not only of different ecological survey methods, but also by employing a variety of social science approaches, including the participatory mapping and the connected interviews that I talked about before. And this is really enabling us and pushing us toward a whole ecosystem approach to understanding this estuary and thinking about it as a model for other coastal systems around the world, really, where people have these multifaceted connections to the system and also have a lot of knowledge that they can contribute to stewardship of it. So as I mentioned, Sarah's PhD research is focusing on these ecological and also economic connections between the oyster populations. And thanks to NOAA and to UMaine, she will continue that work. We also have a project kind of in a totally different sector or mode, and that's led by Dr. Jess Riley-Moman, who will be working with folks in a number of communities in Maine to help build capacity for participatory approaches to community resilience and ocean renewable energy siting. And so here too, we'll be doing participatory social science and starting by doing a lot of listening in order to help to gather information, but also develop methods that communities can use to support robust public participation in ocean renewable energy development. So I think I've already probably hit all these closing thoughts, but I just want to congratulate those of you for whom this is your first semester at the university, that you've come to a great place to do engaged research, really the best I've been in my career. And it's for the reasons that are already well recognized that I've listed on these slides, that we need both biophysical scientists and social scientists, and I would say humanists engaged in this work as well, in order to understand these systems well enough to do a better job of taking care of them. It's also well recognized in this building and elsewhere that engaged research takes time and that there are multiple outcomes and rewards to doing this work. And so congratulations for choosing a place that recognizes that. And I hope I've given you some small examples of how knowledge co-production with community partners can not only be beneficial for broader impacts, but also in terms of doing really creative and exciting research. So I look forward to our discussion. Thank you.
Let's all, wherever we're seated, clap. That was just amazing. That was just so wonderful. Heather, this is just so very interesting in terms of all that you shared with us and how we got a whole semester of learning from 1 hour of listening to you. It's just wonderful. But one of the things that you did early on is list some of the folks contributing to the projects and how important that has been. Volunteer committees involving students so that they get study experience, high school students as well as college students, lists of folks contributing to the projects, state government. Are there suggestions you have for us about how to make that happen?
That's a really good question, Linda. I think some of it is about individual preference and personality, and some of it books and talks like this hopefully help with. First of all, I'd say it's important, regardless of how gregarious a person you are, to show up to public places and to listen in public spaces. And the showing up and the listening those can be hard, but there's so much more important than talking. In fact, not talking is a really good idea. I think I waited 3 years. I tried really hard for the first 3 years not to talk in those shellfish meetings. And those of you who know me know that I don't bite my tongue often enough. But it's something that I think about almost daily is, am I listening? Am I really listening to what the other people in the room are saying to me or to one another? And then I think, in addition to showing up to those public spaces, being strategic about where you show up. And so there's a lot of good ways to do this type of work. And in our case, the partnership with the local high school evolved really organically and wonderfully after building the partnership with the town, between the town and the Darling Center and the Harvesters. In other cases, it might have evolved differently. But there were interested people who wanted to build that connection with the high school. So that was a direction we leaned into because we saw interest and we were interested too.
And is there anywhere where people can read about that great example of working with a local high school so that they can then ask you questions about sort of, is it just something special you do, or is it something that we can all think about doing?
I think there's some great resources specifically in Maine. We've learned a lot, and here I guess I turn to Sarah maybe. We've learned a lot from other high schools and research institutes around Maine who've done this type of work. So I don't know, Sarah, if you want to comment on that.
I guess we could reference the Hutchinson Center. They've done work, and then also colleagues at the Darling Center who have established connections with local high schools. So Larry Mayer is an example, and he's done work with both the high school in Damariscotta and Newcastle, but also around the Madomic. And so I think there are mentors out there who can talk about their processes and how they made these connections. And we can definitely.
That's very helpful. You know, one of the things that you kept saying is listening, willingness to listen, and how important that is. And I think we're all gonna, as we you know, walk around tonight, taking a walk, we'll go listening. How can I do this? You talked also a lot about how can community engaged researchers contribute to coastal community resilience, and you also talked about how long all of this takes. How did you balance those two things?
Well, I think it really comes down actually to student work plans. And so, you know, we're fortunate to have about 30 interns at the Darling Marine Center every summer, and 2 or 3 have been able to work with us on this project and related projects since its initiation. And so there, the time frame is really short, and you have to think about, okay, how can this person who's only with us for 8 weeks or 12 weeks walk away to their next endeavor and feel excited, and if not excited, at least sure about what this work is. And so I'm proud that we have students who will never, ever survey clams in the mud ever again. I think we maybe had a better success ratio on the social science research side, and that's another conversation. But, you know, thinking about that short project and just people learning what it means to do this type of work and then taking that with them wherever they go. And then to have the great fortune of having graduate students who have a longer time frame, but still very finite. And so figuring out what's possible and is intellectually going to be worthwhile to do, but also meet the goals that I've outlined here in terms of principles of community engaged research that extend beyond that knowledge generation. So those student timelines, even though they're variable, have definitely helped frame things.
Great. You talked about the great project about collating local knowledge and participatory mapping, and you showed those wonderful stickers. Is there some place we can go and look at those, either online or elsewhere? That was all just so interesting.
So those actually are part of human subjects research. And so through our IRB with UMaine, they're actually confidential. But we can definitely share examples. And Linda, I have some extra copies of the materials if you're interested in checking those out. Because we have about 10 each left for each estuary. So the materials are here and ready to be.
Sarah, can't people go read your master's? thesis is more about. the
Yes,
content.
Exactly. And that'll have aggregated maps of the data that are non.
And I know we're close to running out of time, but we all want to know how we can run into you at a grocery store and engage you in conversation.
Hey, Linda,
How do we
could
do
I? Can you hear me, Linda?
Yeah.
Okay, and I don't want to miss a question here.
Sure.
Before we let Heather do that, if that's okay.
Yeah.
So, I think if you speak up, we can hear you.
Hello, my name is Chris. I'm from the Department of Civil Engineering. I'm assistant professor there. And I'm working on the intersections of resilience with social variables, but also with the built infrastructure.
Mhm.
In the graph you've shown, you have the social component
Yes.
and the environmental component. Right?
Yep.
In this framework, how does the built environment
Mm-hmm.
plays a role? Or is something that has to be developed, or is something that can be included within this framework?
That's a really good question. So just to be sure everyone heard, the question was about the role of the built environment in the context of the social ecological systems framework. And Marty Andrews at Arizona State University has published specifically on building out that component of the built environment. I'm not sure I'm as up to date on that element as I would like. And so I would encourage you to look at Andrew's work, Anderis, as a starting point, but that is a bit of an older paper now. And so I suspect that there's additional studies that have focused particularly on the built environment. And the other thread that I'm aware of comes out of the urban long-term ecological research site community, the urban LTERs. And there's been a reasonable focus growing through time on the built environment in the context of social ecological systems.
Thank you so much.
You're welcome.
I
Yeah,
enjoyed your presentation.
thank you very much.
Okay, so now you get.
Oh, and to go back to the grocery store science, yes. Well, so maybe it's easier for you to talk at the grocery store than to sit at public meetings. They both tend to happen at 7 p.m. for me. But I take my opportunity and responsibility, particularly as director, very seriously. And so even though I grocery shop in a haze most evenings, I do my best to interact with people, particularly people who I recognize from both places outside the grocery store, and just try to share what's going on at the Darling Center. And so I hope that each of you will come to the Darling Center if you haven't had a chance to visit in a while or ever, and know that we're excited to talk with you there about community engaged research.
Thank you so much for, and David, did I interrupt you?
I was just going to say, I think we learned that great to talk at the grocery store, but not about social ecological.
That's true. Yes, I would not recommend that.
And we've learned that important things take a long time. So pay attention to that. That's a really important lesson in all of this. And let's give another hand for this great, great talk. Thank you.
Thank you all.
Everybody.